Thank you very much for introducing my paper. And the title of my presentation, you have it before your eyes, refers to the controversy, I guess, between Westerners and Muslims on human rights and democracy. And by doing so, it immediately touches on the question of otherness, which is the principal topic of our conference. As you all know, human rights, which according to many of their advocates claim universal validity, are very frequently suspected in the Islamic world to be a result of Western striving for global supremacy. And in addition, democracy, which many hold to be a political model for all countries in the world, is blamed for being an essential part of Western economic and technological domination. And with this background in mind, I will first outline the framework of the ongoing debates on human rights and democracy with special respect to their implications on cultural identity. In the second part of my paper, I will briefly outline the approach to human rights and democracy presented by the Pakistani scholar Muhammad Tahir-ul-Qadri. And finally, I will assess ul-Qadri's approach critically and propose some ideas to bridge the gap between the claim of universality that is inherent to the Western understanding of human rights on the one hand, and the Islamic legitimacy of human rights and democracy on the other. So, the first step. Current debates on the advantages and disadvantages of human rights and democracy are not restricted to the evaluation of theoretical concepts or the assessment of political practice. Instead, they are an integral part of an ongoing struggle for cultural identity. Due to the technological and economic dominance of the West, and probably very soon the dominance as China as well, discourses of identity between the Western and the Islamic world most frequently are focused on cultural patterns. Opposing Western dominance in technology and economy, Muslims claim superiority in moral and religious matters. Usually, debates on cultural supremacy are not confined to theoretical arguing. Instead, they affect the concrete ways of cohabitation in a pluralistic society and the possibilities of political participation. Performed on the media, they shape legislation and jurisdiction. Not least, they determine the way of dealing with ethnic, religious, social, and sexual minorities in society. Admittedly, any identity needs demarcation with regard to the other. It's a philosophical principle that determination presupposes negation. In Latin, it's omnis determinatio est negatio. Thus, it is not surprising that current debates on human rights and democracy between Westerners and Muslims touch on the basis of human self-understanding and the perception of the other. Cultural identity is based on what a certain community has in common and by what means or qualities it is distinguished from other communities. Very often, such a distinction entails hierarchical implications. The qualities that form the identity of the community are superior to the qualities of other communities. It is here where emotional dimensions of identity are introduced in mutual relationships between different communities. And this applies all the more in the case of dialogues between Westerners and Muslims on human rights and democracy. On the one hand, Westerners frequently ask to what extent Muslims, or Islam in general, are able to receive human rights and democracy as universal values in duty of a fruitful cohabitation in pluralistic societies. The respective level of observance of human rights and democracy serves as a scale that shapes the perceptions of Muslim countries from the Western perspective. And while emphasizing the universal validity of human rationality, Westerners often restrict Islamic reasoning to a particular religious tradition. Muslims, on the other hand, frequently strive to introduce genuine Islamic values into the philosophical debates on human rights and democracy. Claiming some supremacy of such values, very often this serves to compensate deficits in the realms of politics, economy, and technological innovation. From a Muslim perspective, two ways of relationship to human rights and democracy are common. According to the first, acknowledgement of Western standards introducing a striving for the implementation of human rights and democracy in the Islamic states, even at the detriment of cultural identity. As I perceive, only a minority in Islamic states is advocating for such a way of policy. Alternatively, Muslims insist on the peculiarity of Muslim values and oppose them to the neo-colonialist project of universalizing human rights and democracy. According to this position, human rights and democracy are absolutely strange elements with regard to Islamic tradition and culture. Consequently, human rights and democracy must be rejected and dismissed. They are only applicable insofar as anchored in Sharia, which means in Islamic law, tradition, and customs. As you probably know, certainly know, a number of well-known declarations on human rights issued by Islamic organizations in the last decades more or less clearly express such a limited approval of human rights. According to my view, however, such reservations are expressions for striving for or consolidating cultural identity by othering non-Islamic traditions. Thus, the tendency to othering the Muslim world by Westerners is mirrored by othering the Western culture by Muslims. This having said, I come to the second part. This bearing in mind, I turn to the contribution of the Pakistani scholar Muhammad Tahir-ul-Qadri on our topic. Tahir-ul-Qadri is an acknowledged Pakistani scholar in law and science of Islam who now lives in Canada. In the Western world, Tahir-ul-Qadri became known because of his fatwa against suicide bombers and terrorism carried out in the name of Islam in 2010. Ul-Qadri's fatwa has been published in English, Indonesian, and Hindi, while translations have been performed in Arabic, Norwegian, Danish, Spanish, French, and other languages. It gained worldwide attention and was appreciated as a tool in the intellectual and ideological struggle against violent extremism in the name of Islam. Ul-Qadri was born in 1951 in Pakistan. He completed the traditional studies in classical Arabic studies with traveling all around the Islamic world, and after finishing his academic studies, Ul-Qadri became to practice law in the district courts of his homeland. And after that, he continued researching at the University of Punjab in Lahore. Very quickly, Ul-Qadri emerged as one of the Pakistan's leading jurists and scholars of law and Islam. He was an advisor to higher courts in Pakistan and well-known counsel at public administration. Slower. Okay. Okay. Living in Canada since 2005, Ul-Qadri organized the Peace for Humanity conference in London in 2011, which was attended by about 12,000 people. The conference announced the London Declaration, a charter for world peace. And twice, in 2012 and 2014, Ul-Qadri organized political manifestations in Pakistan to protest against the government's corruption and to demand the creation of an independent body to conduct electoral reforms. In 2019, Ul-Qadri retired from politics. Not surprisingly, Ul-Qadri very frequently in his argument refers to events and texts of the Islamic history. The original preaching of the Prophet, his advice to the followers, and the example of Muhammad's behavior in Mecca and Medina are referred to in order to prove that the essence of Islam is creating peace and harmony among human beings. Ul-Qadri clearly acknowledges that the interest of his Western audience is directed to what Muslims think about human rights and democracy. And thereby, his strategy is very clear. All the values in the West claims to represent, or all the values the West claims to represent or have invented are deeply anchored in Islamic tradition. And what is more, it is in Islamic history that human rights and democracy have been established first. In Medina, when Muhammad was responsible for establishing a commonwealth, he introduced elements of jurisprudence, economic justice, and even equality of sexes that preceded developments in Europe for centuries. And this is the basis argument Ul-Qadri presents. And not surprisingly, Ul-Qadri regards the famous Constitution of Medina as the first constitution in human history. Therein, in this constitution, Ul-Qadri identifies quite a number of basic human rights. He lists the freedom of religion, the forbiddance of bloodshed, the protection of human life, the right of privacy, the right of equality, the guarantee of legal justice, and the guarantee of a free trial. All this, according to Ul-Qadri, is all already covered or entailed by this Constitution of Medina. Explicitly, Ul-Qadri compares the text, in his proposal and speech, Ul-Qadri composes the text of the Constitution of Medina with the British Charter of Liberties. It was launched in the 12th century, the Magna Carta, signed in the 13th century, and the Bill of Rights from the 17th century. And respective to the United States of America, Ul-Qadri refers to the Declaration of Independence proclaimed in 1776 and the final constitution in 1778. Ul-Qadri points out that only in 1865 human rights were approved as part of the American Constitution by its 13th Amendment. This amendment refers to the abolishment of slavery. Additionally, only in 1920 did the 19th Amendment of the American Constitution remove gender discrimination from the Constitution and granted women the right to vote. With regard to the Constitution of Medina, Ul-Qadri claims that all the rights approved in the aforementioned constitutions were established already, quote, 14 centuries ago. Very soon, according to Ul-Qadri, a complete structure of governance was established on the basis of the constitution. I quote, governors were appointed, power was delegated at the provincial level, forming a local government system for the first time was in Medina. Political unity was created in the form of a nation state, and the Holy Prophet enforced a system based on the rule of law. End of quotation. Ul-Qadri emphatically argued that Islam was the first to recognize basic human rights. Almost 14 centuries ago, it set up guarantees and preserves rights that have only recently been incorporated into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, approved 48 by the United Nations. According to this view, all achievements of allegedly Western political thought and action derive from Islamic roots. Another quotation, concepts such as consultative law, mutual assemblies, passing resolutions prior to the enforcement of law were introduced to the Arabs and by extension to the world by the universal prophet, end of quotation. Based on divine revelation, the prophetic model later was communicated to all nations by the spreading of Islam. And these dynamics of globalization embrace even women's rights, Ul-Qadri argues. Quote, women were appointed as members of parliament, officers, and administrators in the administrative structure of the state of the Medina, end of quotation. It's now my intention here to go into the details of the historical report and the textual history of the Constitution of Medina. Instead, I would stress the strategy of reasoning. The strategy of reasoning Ul-Qadri applies. And this strategy is rather obvious. It is not the Western culture wherein human rights and democracy are anchored. Instead, it is the revelation of the Quran, the example of the Prophet, and his way of governing in Medina that laid the basis for the first constitution in human history. What Westerners claim to be an invention of Western culture, in truth, has been invented many centuries before by Muhammad and his successors. This is exactly the strategy I call embracing the other in the title of my paper, embracing the other. Third and last part of my presentation. However, my judgment on Ul-Qadri's approach to human rights and democracy is differentiated. On the one hand, I appreciate very much that Ul-Qadri does not blame human rights and democracy as a neo-colonial project, claiming that human rights and democracy are anchored in the very first teaching and practicing of the Prophet, Qadri acknowledges human rights and democracy as authentic elements of Islam. Western domination in economy and technology appears as a tool for spreading Islamic values, so to say. On the other hand, when saying that everything which was achieved in the century-long struggle for human rights in the West is already perfectly given in the first decades of Islamic history, Qadri over-hastily bridges the gap between his particular understanding of human rights and democracy and the differences. That gap undoubtedly exists between any understanding of what may be called human rights in the 7th century and today. Premature conclusions, however, prevent learning from persisting differences. And this is even more the case due to the fact that it is not clear at all if Qadri's construing of the historical origins of Muslim understanding of human rights and democracy can pass historical investigation. And what is more important, many examples that Qadri presents in order to prove his thesis are examples of good behavior of the Prophet, and his followers. They only bear legal implications when people acknowledge the behavior of Muhammad and his successors as being normative for individuals, societies, and states in general. This might apply with regard to Muslims. However, it is not a sustainable base for any universal legitimization of human rights. A comparative look at the Western and Muslim understanding of human rights and democracy recognizes the persisting differences between both traditions of political agency and government. Not being aware of these differences bears the risk of missing the opportunity to learn from the other. So finally, I will present an alternative approach. In 2014, the Egyptian scholar Mahmoud Bassiouni, who is a researcher at Frankfurt University in Germany, published a book on human rights between universality and Islamic legitimacy. In 2020, the book was published in Arabic, Hukuk al-Insan baina al-Kaunaniya wal-Ashmuriya al-Islamiyya. In this book, relying on the Islamic concept of maqasid al-Sharia, Bassiouni emphasizes the category of needs as a basis for Islamic legitimization of universal human rights. Relying on the concept of maqasid al-Sharia, or goals or objectives of Sharia, and referring to universal human needs, Bassiouni proposes a concept of human rights that is based on Islamic faith and tradition, a concept of universal human rights based on Islamic faith and tradition. As a result, Bassiouni escapes a double trap, either rejecting universal rights as being opposed to the Islamic faith, tradition, and culture, or embracing human rights as originally anchored in the Islamic faith by neglecting its persistent differences. Unlike Qadri, Bassiouni does not claim that human rights, as approved in the General Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, are equal to the concept of human rights, derived from his concept of human needs and in the perspective of maqasid al-Sharia. While the Western Declaration conceives human rights more negatively, the Islamic approach to human rights respects human needs in a positive way. However, both approaches tend toward a universal legitimacy and validity of human rights. I judge Bassiouni's approach to human rights as a valuable alternative to Qadri's thoughts. Through his strategy of embracing the other, Qadri misses the opportunity to learn from different approaches to human rights and democracy, and also from different legitimizations. There's not only one legitimization of the human rights. If we consider the historical conditions under this, the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 was approved, it is quite clear that it needs some different arguing in the proceeding of time. So, to conclude, without any reservation, Qadri's condemnation of religiously legitimated violence should be appreciated. Furthermore, we should welcome his attempt to bridge Islamic and Western cultures. Nevertheless, his strategy of denying the persistent differences in Western and Islamic legitimation of human rights and democracy fails the opportunity for further development. It fails the opportunity for further development. A universal agreement on the validity of human rights and democracy based on human rights, as Bassiouni proposes, is seemingly more promising to achieve a universal acceptance of human rights and democracy in the Islamic world. Thank you for listening.